RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Pro Athlete Supplementation. Check them out at pas-nutrition.co.uk for all your supplementation needs. And don't forget that subscribers to the Rugby Renegade program get a 40% discount on retail prices. Yes, welcome back to episode 55 of the Rugby Renegade Podcast. My name is Jamie Bain and today I interview Mladen Jovanovic of Complementary Training. Mladen's a great guy. I've followed him for many years. He's put a lot of stuff, really good information out on his blog, Complementary Training, and we go into depth into his agile periodisation, strength training and exercise selection, and how he programs running conditioning for sports. And he's got tons of experience in football, Aussie rules and other sports, and he's currently doing a PhD, so he's a very intelligent guy, so I'm sure you get tons out of it. So give us a listen and let us know what you think. Hi Mladen, welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Great to have you on. Why don't we start by you just telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into strength and conditioning, and some of the teams and athletes you work with.
Hi Jamie, thanks for having me. In short, I'm based in Belgrade, so I finished the Faculty of Sports here in Belgrade, and I'm pursuing the PhD at the same faculty. But around 2007, I started my first professional gig was in soccer, local soccer club playing second division, FC Rad. That was in my fourth year of faculty, or when I was about to graduate. So it was pretty, let's call it like a really scary experience, because I never actually worked in a professional club, and I was lucky enough to be recommended by a friend of mine for a head S&C position. And imagine how it is for a student to just immediately start working in a professional club with a resume. So it was pretty scary, but I survived. So that was my first experience as a S&C coach. It was one, I would say, very, as I mentioned before, very, I would say, hard experience, but also very educational experience in terms of surviving with zero equipment, and all the stuff that comes with working in a professional soccer. So it was like a wake-up call, like a very, very hard wake-up call. But it took me a few years to pick up some info from my experiences and universities and textbooks and so forth. So hard lessons, but I guess I learned some of them. So anyway, after that, I was back and forth to that same club for over multiple times or multiple years. But most recent experience were and most meaningful were I was a head S&C in Hammarby in Stockholm, Sweden for 2 seasons. After which I moved on to Doha to work as a football physiologist at Aspire Academy. And afterwards I was with Port Adelaide Football Club in Adelaide in Australia with Australian rules. After that I was back to Serbia for, I think this is my 3rd or 4th year here. I started PhD and started a business, trying to consult and build coaching tools and so forth.
That's cool, and I can attest. Your website's a real good source of information for myself over the years. And having looked through and read some of your work over the years, you talk a lot about periodisation, and you've got this, I believe it's agile periodisation you call it. Could you sort of tell us your approaches to periodisation, please?
So, agile is something that I kind of stumbled, and it made sense. So I was reading some stuff on the agile project management in IT, and they were questioning the contemporary practices called the contemporary project management practices, mostly referred as waterfall practices. So everything is planned ahead, all the phases are planned ahead, and then you just follow up the practices. But what they've been showing is that this type of planning seems to be working in certain domains that are less complex compared to a software industry, where the market shifts very quickly, the demands shift very quickly, technology moves very quickly. So they show that this type of planning, the contemporary waterfall planning, was not really up to the task. So they kind of designed something that's done in a shorter iterations, with a more frequent testing, with less assumptions and so forth. And I immediately saw a potential transfer to planning domain. So I was reading more about it, and I saw the certain fit. So one of the major, I would say, standpoint from the agile perspective is that we are dealing with a complex domain, and love it or not, love it or hate it, we are always experimenting with it, at least. So even if you know the best practices, even if you know the evidence-based research and so forth, once we apply the interventions, we are always experimenting. And from the agile periodization perspective, it's a little bit, complex topic that has multiple components. But the major one is approaching planning from a uncertainty perspective and using simple heuristics that can help us protect from the downside in a way of making sure that we don't make major mistakes, and also reaping the benefits of the upside. So that's the major major stance of the agile periodization. But it's pretty much the forest of some of the ideas underneath it, and I'm still trying to kind of get my head around it and trying to develop a practice that could be useful and understandable to coaches.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I like where you're taking from other industries, and that's affecting your thinking. Is a lot of the time we just look in at what's already there within our realm, and like I say, you can learn a lot from other things. And you touched on testing. That's something I wanted to ask you. What's your philosophy on testing? I've gone away from doing that one major testing day and try and sort of have it as part of the program per se. How do you fit it in and use it in your periodization?
I generally agree with you. So I have this idea. I don't know if it's originally mine, but I think a lot of people came to the same conclusion. I just call it the embedded testing. So embedded testing is that pretty much the testing without testing. You're trying to test, actually collect the data as much as you can from the training practices. So rather than having a designated days to perform testing sessions, the embedded testing idea calls for trying to get as much information from training practices. So just kind of put it under the surface. So it's like people are not being actually aware of they're being tested, and I think it could be a little bit more ecologically valid. Some athletes freak out when they're tested and so forth, but again, they need to kind of perform on a given day. So most of them are used to it, but the idea is also saving time. So if you have a designated day for testing or multiple days for testing, you just lose time. So the idea behind the embedded testing is to try to collect as much information you can from the training practices. The only problem is this, it's the idea. So I'll give you an example. So imagine you want to estimate the maximum velocity of the Ferrari. Ideally, you want to test it on a straight line, so like something that it's not constraining the car. So you can estimate the maximum velocity. And the other option will be to kind of have a certain distance, for example, from your home to work, and then you kind of test how much it takes to get there. So the numbers you're going to get will depend on the traffic. So you're going to depend on the traffic, depend on the congestion, and on traffic congestion and light and all this stuff. So here's the kind of dichotomy. So some of the stuff in practices will limit the realization of the potential. So in this case, the car maximum speed will be limited by traffic, right? So quite similar in a training. So now we have this dichotomy of, are we actually testing the underlying potential of the athlete, or what's being manifested in the training practices? So I would say it's kind of tricky, and we always need to keep this dichotomy in mind. But for example, if you're testing, say, maximum sprinting speed, ideally you want to test with timing gates, or you want to test with track or specialized equipment on a designated day when you have a maximum or a certain distance for running or a flying sprints or whatever. But now we have I would say, without going into a reliability and measurement error of the GPS devices, we can get a glimpse into what might be the athlete maximum speed or maximum velocity from training and game data, GPS training data. So we can find, we can search from GPS data, for example, last 7 days or last 1 month rolling, and try to find the fastest, say, 2-second period. So again, if you remember the car analogy, it can depend on the game or game scenario or the training scenarios to kind of conclude that this is the actual potential. But again, it can give us some type of a glimpse of what's happening across the time, if the athlete is actually manifesting improved performance. Again, assuming that the game drills and the training actually allows or doesn't constrain that manifestation of the maximum velocity. So it can be expanded to another, say, physical traits or physical constructs, such as maximum aerobic speed. So you can, maybe using a GPS stuff, you can find maybe the toughest 5-minute period, like where the athletes cover the most distance, and you can kind of plot that across time. So let's say we use like a search period of like a last period in a game or in a training sessions, and if you plot that, we can get some type of the glimpse into what's happening across time. So is this manifestation increasing or decreasing or something like that? So I'm not saying that we can actually ditch out completely testing, but maybe we can kind of supplement or complement the testing data with this type of embedded testing. But again, we just need to keep in mind this the car analogy, if this makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like working in rugby and football and Aussie rules, there's so many different stresses. Where it's technical, tactical, and the S&C program. You've got to take all those into account in any type of whether it is out and out testing or whether it is GPS data from a game or training.
So for example, to kind of continue on this one, so another option will be, so if would be, rather than having, say, for example, the sprint test or maximum sprinting test or 40-meter dash or 20-meter dash, rather than having like a designated day saying, okay, today we're going to test, why don't we, so we are still training speed sessions, and we're going to have speed sessions, multiple times a week. Why not collect the data during those sprint sessions? So, you don't call it testing, you just call it monitoring. Let's see, what's your fastest time. And even, providing this type of feedback can have a positive and negative effects. The positive effect would be, you can increase competition between the athletes. That could be beneficial in terms of, them competing and manifesting higher acute performance, and hence maybe having a better chronic effect. But it can also maybe create a stress for the metrics or something like that, to go those lines. So rather than having like this, estimating the car in a urban jungle, so estimate the maximum speed from a game data, we can actually help in constraining the search and say, like, we're gonna try to estimate the maximum speed from the speed sessions, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And maybe collect the data during the speed sessions rather than having a designated testing day. So this can work also for other components as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you're saying there about how it can be a negative, I'd say a good example is when using velocity-based training, for example, obviously you get that competition and you've got that number for them to chase, so it should increase their performance. But sometimes when they're chasing that number, their technique goes out the window. So that's something you also need to be aware of and make sure that they're performing it well and producing, those high outputs. Is that the type of thing you mean there?
Oh yeah. So I think also depends on the context. So for example, for let's call it open-end ballistic exercise. So by open-end, I mean the jump or a throw or something like that, where the bar doesn't need to reach a certain height. So which can be applied to, say, Olympic lifting. So I'm not a big fan of using velocity stuff on Olympic lifting. And maybe also on a grinding movement such as squat, deadlift, and so forth. But if we provide, say, a peak velocity or mean velocity for ballistic movements, for example, like a hex bar jump or bench throw or something like that, I think we are less likely to screw up the technique. And this feedback could be useful. Where, for example, in Olympic lifting, if you give if you're doing a hand cleans or power hand cleans, or you need to catch the barbell in a certain position, for example, a half squat or something like that, and if you provide the, say, peak velocity or mean velocity metric, and you create a competition, we might run the risk of people doing a muscle clean. So something like that, just screwing up the technique, so the numbers could be rigged, or improved. So we always, with all the metrics, there comes the benefit and the drawbacks with all the metrics. So I think it's called a Hawthorne effect or something like that. So every time you measure something, you create incentive, and that incentive can actually be opposite of what you actually expected. So I think it's called a Hawthorne effect.
Okay.
Just can't remember exactly.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Definitely something to be aware of when you're using whether it's velocity-based training or speed metrics. You touched on maximal aerobic speed there, and something I wanted to ask you about, because I think it was your periodisation for soccer ebook many years ago, and you had really good progressions of how you used various sort of running techniques or modalities, including MAS. I was just wondering if you could talk about how you kind of program your running conditioning, if it's changed from what you did back then over the years.
I think it is. But before I even jump to that, some people kind of prefer to do MAS sprinting, and some, or actually MAS conditioning, and some dislike them and so forth. But I think MAS is just like a number that we are using to prescribe, a zoo of the intervals, which is the topic of my book, the HIT manual. Mm-hmm. So it's like saying, for example, if I say I don't like MAS intervals, and it's similar to saying I don't like using 1RMs in a gym. So MAS are just a number that we use to anchor some of the intensities. I look at it as a prescriptive tool rather than descriptive, or like a very physiological tool. It's something to kind of help individualize the HIT running drills, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and those drills could be numerous. My current position when it comes to conditioning for team sports nowadays, I think kind of changed over the years, but not much, is that I like to, even for most sports, I like to do it specifically, like using a specific drills. In this case, for example, soccer could be small-sided games, large and medium-sided games, but on top of that, I would love to kind of complement the specific drills with some of the intervals, and we can approach this with from different angles. So if you're having a GPS data, you can kind of complement, or as we used to call it, top up the distance, or top up the certain velocity bands with the, let's call it in a quotation mark, the dry conditioning, using HIT running, tempo running, or whatever. Or we can just make sure, like, for example, if the if you're playing on a small-sided games, particularly in soccer, where you're going to have a lot of, side-to-side movement, start and stop movement, and less kind of, longer distance straight ahead running, then we can kind of complement that with conditioning drills that are more straight line. And the opposite when we are focusing, for example, in a large-sided games where you're going to have more straight ahead runnings and less side-to-side movements. So the conditioning can be complement to that, and having like more, shuttles and side-to-side stuff and so forth. So again, I see it as a tool to kind of complement the more specific stuff in a sport.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I think, like you said, an athlete, whether it's a football player, rugby player, there's certain things they need to be able to perform. So if they're not getting some of that from their sport-specific training, you've got to add in those extra bits. And obviously, there's benefits of getting, sometimes direct high-intensity stimulus from those. So yeah, it's kind of looking at what's covered off by your rugby trainer or your football, soccer trainer in your case, and then adding to it with your own specific conditioning stuff. So that's a really good point. Now, this is a question we ask all the guests, and it's what do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning? You don't have to be specific about rugby players, but maybe just your athletes you've worked with. What's the biggest mistake they make in terms of strength and conditioning?
Should I focus on soccer or try to be more general?
Up to you. What's the first thing that sort of jumps at you?
It's a tricky question. Well, for a soccer, it's tricky. Like the attitude toward the strength conditioning depends on pretty much on the country or a region. So, say European soccer, like particularly Italian and Spanish, they prefer to do everything with the ball, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which I don't mind. Like, people are fantastically fit and playing. And then we might have American system, the college system, that might have a longer preseason and shorter in-season, where things are more like chopped up in terms of like a very sequential, or like maybe doing a lot of gym work without any technical work, and then switching to kind of only playing and not doing any particular conditioning or strength conditioning work. So again, it depends on the sport and depends on a region. But major mistake, I think we are doing better with the internet and everything. People are still learning, but I think we need to kind of juggle with two extremes, and one is thinking that we can do everything with more specific drills, and the other one will be that we do need to kind of do everything with the general drill. So I think both sides are correct, and as a coaches, we need to figure out what works, particularly from a cultural standpoint and at a particular club. So I would still prefer some type of a lifting year-round, not necessarily for a direct effects on a game performance or a training performance, but also from I would call it a second-order effects by avoiding the potential injuries and so forth. I think that what we make mistake also in strength conditioning is to kind of apply. And this is like a long, old story, everybody knows this, is that we try to apply models from, particularly when it comes to strength training, from a strength specialist to strength generalists, such as, team sport players. So I think that's similar, or that's being used with a strength specialist when working with a strength generalist. One example could be maybe focusing on a particular day, on a particular strength session. So for example, if you have a team playing in season, we usually have a designated day where team strength session might be performed. And what I notice is that, sometimes the coach will skip this session, sometimes that certain athletes will skip this session. And it's pretty much similar to putting all the eggs in one basket, in like all the strength training load in a given day. So if someone misses that day, the next session will be in 7 days, and the previous one in 7 days. So you're going to have like 15 days between two gym sessions. And if this happens in the middle of the in-season, we're going to have more proclivity to experiencing negative side effects such as, heavy legs or soreness. So I think approaching planning from, I would say, not optimality, trying to find the optimal day for a given session, but more from like a robust approach in making sure that if certain changes happen to a training program, the program and the effects will still have some type of a benefit or some type of a protection from changes. And again, changes can happen in team sports from multiple sources, like maybe changing the coach, that will be like really extreme one, skipping a session, getting injured, getting some twerk or tweak, I don't know how you call it in when you get a punch in a muscle, getting sick, losing a game, and then coach wants to doesn't want to focus on any lifting and so forth. So I would say the major error would be to just copy paste the programs from strength specialists to strength generalists.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's still a young industry, and you had a lot of people coming into it from their own background, whether it's weightlifting, powerlifting, and trying to bring all that across and just going, right, that's how you get stronger, but it's not designed for sport. And I think that, I know that's definitely changing. You're getting actual sport specialists, who are trying to improve the whole physical spectrum. So it's improving, but yes, you can still fall back into your background, whether it's powerlifting or weightlifting, and there's other examples as well. But yeah, definitely a good point. Now, talking specifically about strength training, and you've used a term in the past that I like to use myself, and I don't think people consider it in team sports. I think it's very important. It's minimum effective dose. Do you want to kind of touch on what you mean by that?
Can you repeat? I lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you've talked about minimum effective dose in strength training. Wonder if you could touch on what you mean by that.
Oh, well, that's the term that comes from medicine, actually from epidemiology, if memory serves me well. So that's the minimal dose that creates a beneficial effect, or a minimal beneficial effects. And in a theory, it's really clear cut what it means, but in practice, it's really tricky because the effect we're gonna get depends on a lot of things. So mostly from a current state, like the context and the current state that the athlete's in. So, for example, if you define a dose like a tonnage or distance covered and things like that, so theoretically you can say that certain dosage, or let's say like number of lifts in a week. So let's say like you need 20 lifts over 80% of 1 RM to have like a minimal effect. But that depends on frequency, like how that 20 lifts are distributed in a week. So are they in a single day? So that would be like a very concentrated dose, or are they distributed across 7 days? Or it could be like if the athlete is sleeping well, having a good streak in a game performance, or having a shitty streak in a game performance. So this idea of the dose being really fixed to a certain level, it's flawed because it's really hard to pinpoint to exact numbers. But I think the idea is sound. The application is tricky. So I would say the idea is like we should move from a minimum effective dose idea, which is sound in theory, to something which I presented in a new book. It sounds a little bit metaphysical, but using a hero's journey, something like that, in terms of doing something that's doable, that doesn't affect other sport practices, in terms of doesn't create a heavy legs. For example, if you're a combat athlete, a lifting session shouldn't make you suffer on your technical session because of the heavy arms or heavy legs if you're sparring or doing upper body or lower body punching/kicking. So I call this idea the push versus pull. So if you're familiar with the dungeon concept of the bus bench and a park bench, it's quite similar.
Yeah.
So the pushing programs are the programs that try to kind of squeak out maximum amount of adaptation. They are really precise in terms of prescription. The progression steps are really precise. So you're trying really squeeze, actually you're pushing the adaptation. And I think this works particularly for a strength specialist, which brings me back to the previous question we had. So this can work for a strength specialist for a certain amount of time. You cannot do this like a year around. So you probably have like a peaking period for like a month or two, maybe once or twice a year, and that's it. So the push programs work, but they work short. And the pulling programs are more like slow cooking. So they're more like, okay, we're gonna adapt the progression to the adaptation scene. So it's really hard to pinpoint what these exactly mean in terms of dose, in terms of prescription, in terms of expectations from training, but conceptually they are sound. Like I call it phenomenologically. So it's really hard to kind of pinpoint to exact which variable represent the pushing or pulling. Is it volume? Is it intensity? Is it proximity to failure? Things like that. But these kind of overspan these reductionistic metrics. So if I probably you understand it from an intuitive level. So the pulling program will be slowly cooking, adapting, taking it easy when you don't feel really well. So kind of flirting, let's call it flirting with the comfort zone. So if you have a comfort zone and then you have like a pushing zone, you're kind of flirting the comfort zone, but going outside to let's call it a pushing zone. With the pushing programs on the other side, you're really outside of the comfort zone. So I think that the idea from the minimum effective dose should be kind of switched to calling it the pulling or versus pushing programs, if this makes sense. Let me know if this sounds understandable.
Yeah, definitely makes sense.
So this brings me to this idea of using a strength specialist programs to strength generalist.
Yeah.
So the strength specialist program would be more leaning towards the pushing side in terms of prescription. So you might have like exact percentages, exact number of reps, and an exact prescription that someone needs to follow, and which is good for certain periods of time, for off season or something like that. But in season or a longer preparatory period in team sports, you never know how someone might come to training. So these should be kind of adapted to suit the changing training potential of the team sport athletes. So someone might have like a more contacts in a rugby training session, and they might have a hard time squatting and things like that. So the prescription needs to be adapted as well. So in this case, the prescription is more loose, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it can hit, rather than giving like exact number or exact percentage of 1RM or load on the barbell, it can prescribe with a buffer or like a zone. So that will be more leaning on a pulling side.
Yeah.
So over the time, you're going to increase the 1RM used for prescribing. So over time, you're going to make sure that there's a progressive overload happening. But on the mini levels, you're going to allow more wiggle room for the athletes. And I think could be one of the applications of this pushing versus pulling, particularly on the prescriptiveness level. And this is the topic I heavily explained in the upcoming book. Actually, the volume 1 is already available on the website. It sounds like a little bit metaphysical in terms like, I've been eating like a magic mushrooms or something, but I think it's quite similar it's understandable from an intuitive level. Like what do you expectations of the program? How hard are you pushing and squeezing the adaptation and things like that? So it can mean multiple things, and I just explained from a prescriptiveness perspective how these two concepts could be applied.
Yeah, no, I really like that approach. I think the key thing is you said for a start, it shouldn't take away from the sport practice. Obviously, that's the priority. And going back to the previous question, I think it's often a mistake young coaches make because they want to see good results and they want to get their athletes to improve and almost prove their worth. They use these pushing programs, as you use the term, to get those results, but it takes away from their sport practice or puts them at risk of injury, or at the worst instance. So it's definitely a really good point, and good ways of looking at it. You can use your pushing during the off season and maybe start a pre-season, but then you have to have a almost pull back approach moving into end of pre-season as games come in and into the season as well.
Exactly.
Now, so touching on that in terms of young coaches, another question we ask all the podcast guests: what advice would you give to an upcoming strength coach?
I would say get a mentor. That would be the best advice. Get someone more experienced than you that you trust, and someone that trusts you to experiment and kind of help you, guide you through the process. I wasn't that lucky to have a mentor, but nowadays with the internet, you have access to coaches. Like when I was starting, most of us were members of the late Charlie Francis Forum, and Charlie and more experienced coaches were there, and we were able to ask all sort of questions and have them answered, which was really helpful. In learning. But I think ideally the young coach should have some type of a mentor, like a godfather that he can actually call and ask, and help him planning, maybe observe, give him feedback and so forth. I think that can speed up the process much better. And besides, now we have all these, I think we have let's call it the too much educational stuff on the internet, a lot of courses, like shitload of courses, and shitload of licenses, and all different license, different specialization courses and so forth. So someone can be really paralyzed in terms of what course should be taken and so forth. So having someone more experienced, someone more trying to squeeze out the noise from the signal, and maybe helping a young coach kind of stay on the track without getting too much distracted with the noise, with all these tools, with all the different. Try to make him within I would say the signal or the best practices, and help him in not becoming too obsessive or paralyzed by the analysis or let's call it the fear of missing out, or trying to learn from all these different courses, which is fine, but there's abundance of these courses, and people can get paralyzed in terms of I need to know all this stuff, and most of it you don't. So someone who trims this, kind of prune it or trim this idea of that you need to kind of know everything. So I guess that will be my major suggestion. Another would be to try to learn from other sources. Don't try to be too specialist. We can still learn from a lot of other non-related domains. So try to become a generalist rather than a specialist. So for example, that might also mean learning other fields. And I found the most interesting fields like a complexity science, learning the basic statistics, basic, what's the evidence, the probability stuff. It can help your reasoning, so it can enrich your mental power by giving you more mental models that you can use to kind of make solutions to your problems. So I think that would be another suggestion. So to sum it up, would be a mentor, and don't become specialists. Try to become generalists by learning from other domains as well.
Yeah, awesome advice there. Last question. I know we're running a little bit short on time, so just wanted to get your opinion on exercise selection. I know you've written about it in the past, and I've got my own ideas on it, and just wanted to see what your sort of process was for exercise selection.
I'm trying to, over the next few weeks or days, I'm trying to write the third volume, actually, or the second volume in a paperback of the book, upcoming book, the strength training manual. And one of the technique or the models I suggested there is I call it the slot method, not slut but slot. And it's really, I would say, really practical in terms of the training slots. So when you plan training, we create these slots, which would be like a bottom-up approach to planning, and we want to populate those slots. Usually, for example, if you're having a whole body session in terms of a gym, you consider those major movement patterns as slots you need to populate in a training. So, for example, it could be lower body squat, hinge, upper body push and pull. So that's 4, and you already have like a 4 slots in a training, and add there like a core or a ballistic, and that's like 6 slots that you need to populate. So I would say from this slot perspective, you start by defining the major, let's call it the major slots or qualities that you deem important for a given sport. So, for example, sometimes you don't even know what's important when you start. So I'll give you an example of training the combat athletes. I usually start with basic movement patterns, and I address them in a training session. So as I mentioned, like I create a slots when I plan, I create a slots. So again, slots could be upper lower session, it could be total session. So that gives you the kind of slots to populate. So the major classification I use is the difference between the grinding movements and the ballistic movements, and then each can have the subcategories of usually the movement pattern. So it could be as I mentioned before, the squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, core, things like that. So you kind of create those slots in a program. But as you start working with someone, for example, a new sport or a new athlete, you also want to have like the other category. So that's all the other, it's like it's the bottom drawer type of a category where you put everything that you don't know where it belongs. So I'll give you an example from a combat sports. I did notice that most of the combat athletes complain about the neck. So that's quite similar in the rugby, I guess. The neck issues, the neck strength. So then, from that other category, you figure out that, the bunch of the exercise that you kind of started using are belonging to the neck category. So this category becomes your new slot in a training, right? So you kind of discover as you go. So now we might have, push, pull, squat, hinge, and neck, because, it seems to be important enough to have a designated slot in a training program. Yeah. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I'm going to expand it a little bit more. And this is something that I'm kind of flirting around a little bit lately, trying to create like a framework around it. And I promise I'm going to develop it a little bit further. So I ideally, as I mentioned before, I tend to start. And then I create the slots in a training program that these movement patterns should be prescribed inside the training program. And then as you go, you also kind of leave some room for something that's going to be discovered, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good system. Like I say, you've got a kind of set framework, but you've got the ability to adapt it. And as like you said, experience in different sports, and you see that other things need to be added in, like the neck work. You kind of adapt it as you go through. So that's really
and there's good. There's one more thing I failed to mention, is that this tends to work very nicely when you have small number of athletes, but when when it comes to this slot method, you also need to take into account the constraints of the gym, particularly when you have multiple athletes in the gym. So these slots don't necessarily need to be movement patterns. So again, it could be movement patterns from a strength generalist, or it could be categories of this exercise specificity. So for example, for a strength specialist could be specific bench press movement, specific deadlift movement, general strength movement, general bench press movement, general deadlift movement, and so forth. So how you classify depends on your context, depends on on who you are working with. So there's no objective way to classify exercises. It depends on who's looking at the exercises, or depends on how you plan to use them. And the third approach would be to kind of keep in mind the facility constraints, particularly when you work with a lot of athletes. So for example, usually we have like a power unit or power station. That's like a squat rack station where you can do one exercise. And then you might have a dumbbell station, and maybe have like a ground mobility station, something like that. So these could be your training slots in a training program, because you need to kind of organize athletes around those spots in the gym. Yeah. So you might have, the slot number 1 is a squat rack. Slot number 2 is a dumbbell station. Slot number 3 is a ground mobility. And slot number 4 is like a core, something like that. So the slot framework allows for multiple kind of perspectives in what defines the slot. And in this regard, those are like stations in the gym, and this allows for like a easier organization of a lot of athletes in a one particular smaller confined space. So you can for example you can have these 4 slots, and on each slot you can have you can make sure that all the major movement patterns are hit inside one session. Again, depends on your philosophy or whatever, and then repeat it 2 times. So we might have like a circuit number 1. So this could be on a squat rack, could be a squat, could be upper body press with the dumbbell station. You can have some mobility exercise on the mat, and then side bridge or something. So that will be the circuit number 1, and the second circuit or second 4 slots could also involve these stations in the gym. But in a squat rack you can move the bench in, and you can do like an incline bench press. The dumbbells station can now have like a single leg Romanian deadlift. The ground mobilities could be used to do some neck work, and then the core could be like a landmine twist or something like that. So the slot method is really bottom-up approach to kind of prescribing training, rather than having like a ideal theoretical movement patterns or theoretical qualities that you want to hit. So it can adjust to the facility constraints or what have you. Not sure if this makes sense.
It does make sense.
Try to expand it.
Yeah, it does make sense, and yeah, I think when you're working in sport, you soon figure out that it's a balance between the physiological and the logistical, isn't it? It's exactly. Finding stuff that works in your environment. So no, that's really good advice. So lastly, Mladen, thanks very much for your time. Just last question: where can people learn more about yourself?
So I have a website from 2010, complementarytraining.net or complementarytraining.com. And at the Twitter, I'm physical_prep, so physical prep. Same thing for Instagram, which is more personal, I would say. So these are pretty much three major sources where I kind of post. Also the Facebook page, complementary training. We also post a lot of the job ads, and we're trying to kind of aggregate all the job positions that are currently available in strength conditioning and rehab. So yeah, these are pretty much three: the Twitter, Facebook page, and the complementarytraining.net website. I'm currently working on publishing my second book called the Strength Training Manual. The Volume 1 electronic version is already available, and we're going to follow up in a month. Volume 3, and finally kind of publish it as a paperback edition, which should be available, I think, before January 2020. So that's pretty much it.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we will of course share the links of all those in the show notes, and let us know when that Volume 3 is out, and we'll give you a shout out on our social media as well. But Mladen, lastly, thank you very much for your time. Some great insight into the work you do, and thank you, and all the best for the future.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Cheers. So another great podcast. Thank you, Mladen, for taking the time to talk to us. Tons of great take-home points, and please check Mladen out at Complementary Training. He's got loads of books and content coming out by the sounds of it, so keep checking that out. And in the meantime, keep checking us out at rugbyrenegade.com and on all the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Recently released the Fast for Rugby book, which a few people have been asking for, so hopefully that'll help you get faster. And of course, subscribe to us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, whatever you use to listen to podcasts. And of course, give us a 5-star review, and tune in for next time.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.